Salutators, my potats, am's your Rave, back again with another Read with Rave video. A couple of disclaimers. Disclaimer number one, to avoid copyright infringement, I have already gotten permission from the authors of these stories, as the authors are either myself or my friends, and depending on what story I am reading, I will have a link to the social medias in the description. Disclaimer number two, Read with Rave is not meant for children, as the target audience is young adults and teens. So if you are a smaller child, please jump off this video and go watch my gaming or speed paint videos.
Today, I will be reading The Crossroads Planet, Book 1 of the Crossroads series, by Robert Field.
Chapter 18. Mary listened impassively as Crystal detailed her observations of Lace's condition. She nodded politely at each new revelation. When Crystal had finished, she permitted a trace of a frown on her forehead. I do appreciate you coming to me for advice on matters such as these. It is ever best to have a second opinion. I am afraid that I must confirm your suspicions. In your case, the heart sought and bonded with a compatible mate, though you knew not what that mate was supposed to be. In the case you describe, the person knows who the intended is, and seeks only that person. Whether the other person has received and accepted the bond is not known, since the other person is so distant. In any case, only personal contact between them will complete the bond. It is a problem since the potential mate is far from school and delayed in returning. You are right in surmising that seeking filament is pointed directly at the intended. The seeker knows where the intended is, and so can accurately, if unconsciously, direct the seeking energies. She may indeed have to seek this person out if the person does not show up soon. It will further unbalance her if she does not. I will not ask who this person is. I have my own suspicions, but I am a firm believer in the confidentiality of counselor-patient relationships, where in this case you are the counselor. Good luck with your patient. Crystal thanked Mary and went back to the apartment. Later that day she met up with Lace again and relayed Mary's words on the subject. Lace was clear in her plans, based on this information. She wanted to travel to find and help Bruce. She also knew that she could not do this without help, preferably from Crystal, and also realized that Lance was a part of the package. Crystal looked worried. The start of classes was not far from off. It might take them 2 days to get to Bruce's hometown, and the same to get back. I'd love to help you, but Lance would have to agree, too. Just a moment while I ask him. Crystal established mental communication with Lance and put the question to him. Lance's reply was definite. We've definitely got to help Lace. Since her heart is trying to form a bond, she knows who she wants to bond with. She's not going to be happy or healthy until she does. Crystal closed the communication and relayed the reply to Lace. Now, I think you and I are going to meet up with Mary and tell her where we're going. She will understand. The next day saw the three of them riding the caravan over the southern pass. By evening, they were at the top of the pass in a tiny little inn. They shared a single room and bed, not only to save money, but also because that was all that there was available. Lace was feeling optimistic, but her energy levels were being drained by the filament that sought out Bruce's heart. Crystal held Lace close to her as she infused energy to replenish what was lost. Lace's energies formed a strong aura about her, and Crystal could clearly sense the highly charged emotions they transmitted. Lace turned to Crystal and kissed her on the lips. Crystal could sense the confusion wrought by the pent-up emotions that threatened to further upset Lace's already unstable condition. The kiss turned passionate, and Crystal allowed herself to respond even as she reserved part of herself to extend the spirit sight as far along the questioning filament as she could, but to no avail. Eventually, Crystal managed to get Lace stable enough to sleep, after working through Lance to help to curb up some of the wild emotions. A day later, the sandcrawler deposited them at the capital city. Crystal was very careful and used her spirit sight to check for hostile magics in their vicinity. Everything seemed quiet, though, as they spent the night in the small inn at the edge of the city, and then boarded a westbound caravan heading up into the southwest region of plains and rolling hills. Lace seemed calmer now, as they got closer to Bruce's home in the hills. The caravan, which had been full when it left the city, was getting very empty now. People were rapidly getting off, and nobody had gotten on for some time. Crystal had checked the orientation of the questing filament in the city, and it had pointed squarely in the direction of Bruce's home. They arrived in the town, however, to find that it pointed south of the town. The town itself was eerily quiet. Shops and inns were locked up, and only a few people were seen in the streets. Women were scarce, and children absent. Finally, they went to the town hall, as it was, to find only a few guards in attendance. The guards were quick to confirm their suspicions. A major uprising was under way in the hills to the south of the town, and the able had gone to defend the town. Other townsfolk had gone further west to safer regions higher up in the southern mountains. The guard advised them to do the same. They talked to the guard, and indicated who they were seeking. The guard did his best to dissuade them, but when they would not, issued them a letter identifying them to the defending forces. Grimly they made their decision to press on to where the filament indicated Bruce to be. They went perhaps a mile south of the town on a rough dirt track, and then Crystal stopped them to get a new reading on the filament's orientation. She had her inertial tracker out now, and it was beginning to get an approximate fix on their exact target. She noticed with the extended spirit sight that another filament was fluttering about in the near distance, coming roughly from the direction of the target, but seemingly without sufficient energy to go the entire way to Lace. After several more miles they caught up to it, and it fluttered about in Lace's vicinity, but never touched her. Even as Crystal watched, it seemed to falter and then recede. That news did not make any of them optimistic. Crystal kept Lace appraised of the other filament's behavior while continuing to keep Lace supplied with energy so her filament would not drain her. After several more miles, the trail, which had entered a narrow canyon, rounded a bend and revealed an encampment. It had an obviously military look about it, and they were challenged before they had gone more than a dozen paces. Fortunately, the guard accepted the letter of identification. They were allowed into the camp, but could not proceed further. Proceeding to the center of the camp, Crystal got a new reading. Carefully they made their way to the indicated tent. The flap of the tent was open, and within the tent several cots held a fighter apiece. Nobody particularly seemed to be in charge, so they quietly found the cot that held Bruce. Find him they did. Crystal carefully watched the spirit sight as Lace sat down next to Bruce, took his hands in hers, and gazed deeply into his eyes. The questing filaments found their ways into each other's hearts, and right away both of them became a lot more relaxed. Unfortunately, Bruce was not in the best of shape, emotional considerations aside. He had wounds in various places, carefully dressed, but with an appalling amount of blood soaking into the bandages. Lance immediately started some of his own preparations for healing, while Crystal fed him power to facilitate his skills. Lace simply sat and bonded with Bruce. After a moment, Lance stood up. It doesn't look too good. He's got some internal injuries that will need a lot of healing energy. I don't know if I can do it alone, but Crystal and I can do it together. Lance looked at Crystal and summoned the dream state. An injured man, somewhere ghostly in appearance, lay on his back in a sunny glade. Over him knelt a man and a woman, who proceeded to minister to the injured one. About half an hour later, Lance and Crystal emerged from the dream state. "Whew! That was tedious!" exclaimed Crystal. Lance turned to Lace. "I think he'll be all right now, but we had to use a lot of energy." Lace nodded. "Bruce, dear, can you talk okay now?" Bruce opened his mouth and managed to croak out, "Feeling much better now, thanks to Crystal and Lance and you, dear, too. I've missed you quite a lot. Was going to return to school, but the town was attacked. We had to defend it. Got hit, got hurt." "Will he be able to travel with us?" asked Lance. "We ought to get him away from the fighting. He's in no shape to help them anyway." They went and talked to the officer in charge of the camp, who was reluctant to release a man, but also realized that it was pretty circumstantial that Bruce was involved in the conflict. She also wasn't sure if there was any way for them to go, except either the town or to the protected encampments where the villagers had fled. Bruce wasn't up to walking, so Crystal used a levitation spell to create a leader of energy for him to lie on. The others walked beside as he floated along out of the camp, with only a few raised eyebrows. Shortly they made it back to town, and stopped briefly at the farm where Bruce's family lived. Bruce sat up briefly to assure himself that it was all intact, and then they got directions from the guard in town for the location of the refugee camps. Further up into the western hills they climbed, following a succession of small trails little better than goats' paths, but showing signs of recent heavy traffic. They arrived at the first camp by late afternoon, tucked away in a small ravine. The other camps were all within the space of about 10 miles, similarly situated. The camp was packed with frightened villagers, some wounded, lots of women, children, and elderly. Those charged with providing food, shelter, and healing were woefully overworked. The first greeting was an assessment of both skills and liabilities. Bruce would get a bed in the infirmary section of the camp, only if the others would provide what services they could. Lance and Crystal were immediately set to work, at first on some of the milder cases. They quickly found themselves equal or better to the best healers in the camp, and were assigned to more difficult cases. Crystal drew large amounts of spirit energy to keep her and Lance from being physically exhausted, but hunger overtook them in the late evening, and they had to stop. Fortunately, they had been able to stabilize the most serious cases, and had already earned the respect of what few other healers there were. They retired to the tent which served as a commissary during the day, sleeping accommodations by night, in time for a late dinner. They met up with Lace, who had been busy counseling a healthy as well as the lightly wounded. Crystal quickly gave Lace some energy as well, for Lace was about to collapse. The next day, Lance and Crystal were sent to one of the other camps to assist with the wounded there. The cases were not as bad, and by midday they were at the third camp. Lace, too, was making the rounds, albeit more slowly. Several days later, they had come around again to the first camp, and were discussing the possibility of returning to school. Scouts were reporting to and from the fighting areas, and indicated that the road to the capital city might have fallen into enemy hands, but the village remained safe. Bruce was now able to walk, so the four elected to return to Bruce's home and set out from there if all remained quiet. Bruce had located his family and consulted with them. They did not mind if the group stayed at the farmhouse for a few days, but indicated that the family had no intention of returning to the farm until the evil forces in the area were well and truly driven off. The trip to the farm was made without incident, and the group settled into two of the bedrooms that lay over for a day or two, and consult the scouts as to the status of the highroad. Bruce and Lace had their first opportunity to privately get reacquainted. Crystal examined the spirit filaments between them, and was pleased to inform them that the heart bond was approaching the strength of the one between her and Lance. Those two spent some time telling Lace and Bruce about what they might expect as bondmates, and coaching them in communications and techniques. Now that Lace was quite over the emotional instabilities she had suffered during the trip south, and in gratitude for the efforts Crystal and Lance had put forth to keep her sane, Lace gave both Lance and Crystal additional attitude treatments, replete with all three phases, and did much to correct the emotional disturbances incurred at the camps. Crystal took the time to gain additional instruction from Lace in the art of healing emotions, and the opportunity to practice the art on Lace, who was otherwise had nobody to heal her short of professional healers in town. Lace pronounced herself quite satisfied with Crystal's progress in learning the art. Bruce also offered his own testimonial to the combined healing powers of Lance and Crystal. This was on top of the testimonials offered at the refugee camp. One evening they were all sitting in one of the bedrooms, having a quiet little party for no particular reason at all, except that everyone seemed happy and healthy, and furthermore they planned to leave soon. The cups had been filled a few times, and they were well into the second bottle, with plans for a third. A wide-ranging discussion was in progress, more or less about heart bonds, dream states, various healing arts, and what, if anything, heart bonds had to do with love, followed by several announcements of love for one another. Bruce for Lace, and vice versa, Lance for Crystal, and vice versa. That was followed by several announcements of general love for all members of the foursome, and in turn followed a rather indiscriminate hugging and kissing that was on the verge of getting rather intimate. At some point the conversation resumed, now centered about respect and admiration for one another, followed by enumeration of the various qualities of each person. The description started out with the lofty sentiments and noble ideals, and proceeded to comparisons of physical attributes. This led to close examination of the attributes in question, and some rather intimate mutual inspections. Crystal found her soft, downy, cat-like fur being much stroked and praised, and she found herself not at all embarrassed, oddly enough, since Bruce seemed to be the one of the more prominent strokers. This was followed by a comparison of the male chest hairs, and then Lace and Crystal were placed back to back and then side to side for comparison of their appearances, none of it negative. Crystal got a chance for a first-hand inspection of Bruce's chest hairs, while Lace gave Lance a very friendly embrace. Crystal awoke the next morning in the middle of a large bed. She was sandwiched between two people, neither of them Lance. She looked, and saw Lance on the other side of Lace. It had been a rather interesting evening after all. Today was the day they had planned to depart. Lance awoke soon, and got up, followed shortly by the other three. They stopped in town for the latest reports, all negative, except for unconfirmed rumors of activity a good way to the east. Thus informed, they began the trek back to school. There was no caravans running, so they started out on foot, hoping a caravan service could be had at a village further along. All was quiet along the route for the first day. The second day they were accosted by a group of friendly scouts who appeared from hiding places near the road. "Just where do you think you're strolling off to now?" the group's leader asked them. "We've been tracking the enemy signs for over a day now. Quite possibly they're camping up in the hills round here. You might be walking straight into a trap." The leader bade them to come to the small group's hiding place behind a large rock. For over an hour the foursome had to sit still and not make a sound. Suddenly one of the scouts came crawling up to the group and whispered something to the leader, who then made his way to the foursome. "I hate to tell you this, but we're all in the soup now. Enemy troops have been spotted converging on this location from several directions. Likely they've seen us, and most probably 'cause of you four. Now we're all going to get our sorry butts kicked." Crystal sat still and kept low, but enhanced her spirit sight to look for the presence of intruders in the area. She was appalled at the number she found, but kept calm, and instead drew on the spirit energies to bring her to a state of battle readiness as she had been taught. She did not detect any disturbances in the spirit filaments around her, so doubted that any magi were among the enemy troops now gathering. Her first action was to call into being a grid of shielding energy and lock it into place around the four of them. It would require no further attention from her, and only a minimum of energy to adapt it to instantly a specific use. She also readied a certain amount of energy for attacks. Archers in the huddled group suddenly stood up and began targeting the leaders of several groups of enemy troops that were now quite close. The attack was returned, and from more directions than the little group could aim at. Crystal adapted her shield to protect the entire little group from those they could not defend against, while allowing the outgoing arrows to fly unimpeded. She also split off a portion of the shield to protect solely the foursome. Crystal began to think that some form of attack on her part would soon be called for. She therefore selected a smaller group of attackers that was consistently being ignored due to lack of strength on the part of the defenders, and called forth a large quantity of spirit energy in forms of lightning bolts, directed at the group. Shortly that group was hors de combat, and no longer a threat. Crystal looked around at her three companions. Lace and Bruce sat benumbed and showed little initiative. Lance sat calmly. She knew that he realized he could do nothing but allow Crystal to do what she could. The attackers had noticed the collapse of one of their groups and seemed to pause for a second. Crystal used this opportunity to shift her shields away from the now unthreatened quarter and protect against the remaining groups. The defenders themselves seemed at first nonplussed by the sudden aid, then grimly pleased, as they pressed on with the defenses. Crystal chose the larger of the two remaining groups and aimed her energies at the leaders, lowering their morale and making them easier targets for the defenders. Grimly, she turned to the other group. Finally, the groups closed on their position, but their strength was reduced and the forces more evenly matched. From there on, the battle became a melee of sword fighting, but Crystal continued to direct energy bolts at the rear of the attacking forces, where there was little chance of bringing down the defender. Crystal began to get dazed, and as soon as she noticed, paused to draw on some energy to restore herself. With renewed vigor, she resumed her backstabbing attacks, and slowly the battle turned in favor of the defenders. Finally, it was over, and a few scattered attackers surrendered. Crystal restored her energies again, and then had to lie down, fainting with hunger. Thank you for joining me on today's Read with Rave episode. If you liked, please hit that like button, comment down below if you would like to hear more, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and don't forget to splash the bell icon so you never miss another video, and I will catch you all on the next wave. Goodbye!